So you might understand the concept of the flight zone, be able to answer a quiz, but then when you are actually out there with the cows, these other real life factors come into play. And so I think that maybe we need resources that are more engaging, more active, and not just passive learning.
Welcome to the Rumination Podcast presented by Jefo Nutrition. Hi, I'm your host, Gwyn, and today we'll be discussing finding tools to improve cow handling at the farm level. And with me today to discuss this topic is Dr. Jennifer Van Os, Assistant Professor and Extension Specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Van Os received her PhD in the Interdisciplinary Animal Behavior Graduate Program at the University of California, Davis, and conducted her postdoctoral research in the Animal Welfare Program at the University of British Columbia. The research in her lab at the UW-Madison focuses on understanding, evaluating, and improving the welfare of dairy animals from a biological and social science perspective. The goal of Dr. Van Os's extension program is to promote best practices in management and housing to help the dairy industry adapt as our scientific knowledge about animal welfare continues to grow. Welcome to the show, Dr. Van Os.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm glad to be here.
Before entering in the subject of today's discussion, I'd like to ask, can you explain what brought you to the study of cow handling specifically, of an area of research, an area of need for extension support?
So I started here at UW-Madison about 5.5 years ago. And as you mentioned, I'm in an applied research and extension outreach role. And so I think it's really important that all the work that I do resonates with my dairy stakeholders. And so when I was new, I went around and I met with a number of Wisconsin dairy farmers and other people in the industry to ask them what are the challenges they face when it comes to animal welfare on their farms, and what are their needs? How could my research and extension program help? So one of the most popular requests that I got at the time was, could you please come to my farm and train my employees on the proper handling of dairy cows? And I found that a bit surprising that that was a need that kept coming up again and again. And unfortunately, it was not efficient for me to go around and fulfill this request, but it really got me thinking, how can I direct my research program to try to fill this need that people are asking for better training resources?
No, thanks for that. And in fact, recently in a presentation you did, you showed some older data from 2018 on what the status of this training at the farm level for farm employees interacting with cows was. And you quoted 55% of U.S. dairies providing training on moving or handling dairy cows. And I found this surprisingly low. So I'm wondering, in your work in extension, do you feel in 2023 that this number of 55 is still pretty relevant?
I agree with you. It's surprising. So those data were from the United States Department of Agriculture, and they are now about at least 5 years out of date. And at the time, there was another study that reported what producers had said were the barriers to providing training, whether it was on cow handling or other topics. So one of the biggest barriers is time, which is no surprise. Dairy producers are always juggling a lot. Another was cost. So, for example, if a farm has a lot of workers who speak a different language than the owner or the manager, they might need to hire a translator or a professional trainer. And another barrier was a lack of resources. And I thought that that was surprising because we know that in the North American industry, we have a number of really nice resources about cow handling, very well produced videos, and programs that I've used myself. But I think the fact that producers still thought there was a lack of resources points to a need for something maybe more innovative or different than the offerings that are out there. But to your question about whether this landscape has changed, I would say I hope so. So we administered a survey in Wisconsin last year, and we're still compiling the results. This is in collaboration with UW River Falls. And we want to see what our producers in our area doing when it comes to training, and has that changed? Because in the US, as of early 2020, now the Farm Animal Care Program, in which 99% of our US dairy farms participate, they have an explicit expectation that anyone who works on the farm in an animal touch role, whether they're a milker or calf care staff, they need to show annual continuing education in cow handling or calf handling. So I would hope that now this is something that everybody is becoming more and more aware of, and that we would see an increase in the people who are getting some kind of training or continuing education. But I know that in the past years, this has been a significant area of noncompliance where people are still struggling to find the time or find the right resources to be able to do this sort of education.
And maybe that ties into our next question, which was the concept of low stress cow movement and working in flight zones. I believe certainly my involvement in the dairy industry for a long number of years is pretty well established. Yet, understand from some of your work that applying this concept is a challenge, and I'm wondering why this is and what can be done to improve this adoption.
I think that's a great question. And that was part of why I was so surprised when I moved here that farmers were asking me for more resources and more training. Because you're right, these principles about the flight zone and using the cow's natural behavior to move them, it's very well established. And we know that it works. But I know from my personal experience, when I started working with dairy cattle over a dozen years ago, there was the way I learned in the classroom and in theory, and then there was the way I learned on the farm, and those things didn't always match. And even though I knew the right thing to do, I often resorted to not starting from the very most gentle handling practices, right? You get into poor habits very easily. And I think that speaks a little bit to human psychology or modeling what people's actions are around you. And so I think that maybe that disconnect comes from what we call, so in the pedagogical literature or learning literature in the classroom, there has been a trend in the last few years towards what's called active learning. So, passive learning is when you're just passively taking in information, like listening to a lecture or reading something in a book or even watching a video, which can be a little bit more engaging. It's still passive. So, there's been a trend towards what's called active learning, and this can take a number of different forms. But I hypothesize maybe this is what's happening. When you're moving cows, we know it's a bit of a dance in real life. So it's hard to really put those concepts into action unless you've practiced them. So you might understand the concept of the flight zone, be able to answer a quiz, but then when you are actually out there with the cows, these other real life factors come into play. And so I think that maybe we need resources that are more engaging, more active, and not just passive learning.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think that leads us again to our next question. Was that I believe you're in the process of developing a tool for cow handling training, the Moving Cows educational video game. I'm wondering if you give the listening audience an overview and an update on this project.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this. So, after dairy producers asked me for better training on cow handling, I kind of put this on the back burner and thought, I can't be going out to every farm and training their staff how to do this because I need to run a research program. But then inspiration kind of struck out of the blue. I'm not much of a video gamer myself, but my father in law is a retired commercial airline pilot. And I think most people are familiar with the idea that before a pilot can fly a plane, even if they're very experienced, if they're flying a new aircraft, they have to go through the flight simulator. It's too expensive and too dangerous to put somebody in the cockpit of a plane unless they've had some kind of practice. So, this was the idea I had for cow handling, that we have these passive resources like books or videos that teach you the principles of the flight zone, but to be able to actually put those practices into action, maybe we need a simulator that can let people practice in this safe environment and where we can mimic things that are not realistic to do even in real life hands-on training and sort of put them through the paces before or in addition to going out in real life and practicing with cows. And so that's how Moving Cows was born. So now we have a functional video game, which is played on touchscreen devices that simulates routine cow handling. So taking cows out of their home pen, moving them to the milking parlor, or loading them into the milking parlor.
Cool. And so when are we going to get our hands on this, do you think?
Yeah, so Moving Cows version 1 was finished earlier this year, but we kept it private for research purposes because I think that it's important that if this comes out of a research program, we should do research and make sure that it's something that resonates with our target audience of people who work on dairy farms and that they get something out of it and potentially learn something from it. So, in the meantime, we've also compiled a lot of feedback from people who work on farms, dairy employees, dairy owners, consultants in the industry, veterinarians, to get their input and make sure this game is relevant for them. And so we've now compiled that feedback and we're working on version 2 of the game. So that's currently in process and we're hoping to have a public release by early 2024. So you can look for it in the Google Play Store as well as iTunes for Apple devices. And our hope is to make it free to anybody who wants to play it. And so that would mostly be people on dairy farms so that they could use this for continuing education.
No, that's a super exciting initiative because, as you said, we need to circle back a bit and make sure that the regular training we're doing and the retraining is in a way that the employees and owners can really utilize and use that information. And maybe one other point, if I may just ask, is talk to me about retraining and maybe some of your experience. So we go in often and train people, and then great, you're trained, box checked. What's been your experience about that need for retraining?
Yeah, that's a really great question because we know that there's the information you gain the first time you hear it, you're not necessarily processing or retaining it all. And that's where practice really comes in. And we know there can be procedural drift, especially on a farm where there's people with different levels of experience or people with different attitudes towards working with cows, people who have learned in different ways, and that we can see this drift over time where you might know in theory that something is the best practice, but it is very easy to slip into poor habits. And so I think that's part of the reason why in the US the farm program expects this annual documentation of continuing education, regardless of your level of experience, even if you grew up on the farm. Everybody needs to show that they're refreshing themselves on the topic. And that can take any form right now. It doesn't mean you have to watch the same videos year after year. But with the game, that's something where we actually asked the people on the farms who helped us test the game, imagine somebody with little to no experience with dairy cow handling. How useful do you think the game would be to help them learn these handling practices for the first time? So on a 1 to 5 scale, with 5 being the most useful, on average, the median was a 4. So people thought that it was pretty useful for a new person. But what about what you said, where you need to do this retraining over time? So we asked the same question. Now imagine somebody who does have considerable dairy cow experience. How useful do you think the game would be for helping them reinforce or practice these handling skills? And actually, we found the same thing. So people still gave it a 4 out of 5 for potential usefulness. So I thought that that was really promising, that even people who are experienced can learn something new. And I know that that's even the case for me, where I also fell into some poor habits. And I think that you can sometimes use reminders that things can be done a different way. And I'd love to share an anecdote about that, actually, if you wouldn't
Please
mind.
do.
So,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
we have a separate project. This one's funded by the United States Department of Agriculture, but we're also targeting new training resources for people about cow handling. And here we do talk a little bit more about human psychology and how habits form and how to avoid getting into this sort of negative feedback cycle. But as part of that project, we're filming some more traditional passive learning videos on our research dairy. And I have a graduate student, Monica Ruiz Ramos. She's a native Spanish speaker, and she's a really good cow handler, but she is new. And she had never worked with the cows at a research dairy. And these cows participate in a lot of research. They're very used to handling. And I think most people would think, okay, these cows have become like pets. They're used to a lot of human interaction. They're going to be hard to move. They're going to be stubborn. They're not going to just obey these principles of the flight zone, right? People have this stereotype that these friendly cows have no flight zone. So for these videos, we went into the parlor and wanted to demonstrate how you can load cows without making a sound, without touching them. So these cows had never seen Monica before, never worked with her, and she just walked around the parlor and the cows flowed in without a hitch. It was beautiful. It took one take to shoot this video. So I'm telling this story just to remind people that these best principles do work. It really is possible, even with these cows that you would think would be too friendly or stubborn or not have a flight zone anymore. The principles do work. And so that's why I think even experienced people can use these reminders and see it with their own eyes and find that, yes, there is a way to make this work. And it really can't hurt to hear that message.
No, that's exciting, and thanks for sharing that because that's the ultimate objective is this low stress handling for both the handler as well as the animal. And
Exactly.
yeah, we always remember the complaints we were given about our 4-H calves and not being able to handle them. So thanks for sharing that. So as we're wrapping things up, uh, some key take home messages that producers, nutritionists, veterinarians, and industry influencers that you feel should have taken away from today's podcast.
I think the first takeaway is something actually we didn't explicitly discuss, but I want to make it explicit, which is a lot of people don't realize that animal welfare is a science and it's something that isn't just based on opinions and emotions. It's something we do research on and that we quantify, and that people like myself do listen to the needs of the dairy industry, and we are trying to help by doing this research. And so that's how I began working on this topic in the first place, was due to stakeholder demand. So I'm here to try to innovate and provide real practical solutions for the dairy industry to improve animal welfare. The second take home message is about learning, which is there is definitely a place for traditional or passive learning. Those resources are very valuable. We're producing some of those ourselves. But when we're thinking about people being able to retain concepts and practice them and learn by doing, that's where active learning comes into play. So I think the game is one example of that, where we can try to do something that's a bit more engaging and allow people to learn by doing. And then the last one is, if you would like to test out the game, hopefully that will become available soon. But my door is always open. Please email me if you have any questions. And I really can't wait to put this out there and hope that it can help the industry and help people feel more confident in their jobs.
No, brilliant. Thank you for that. And thank you, Dr. Van Os, for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And I also want to thank our listening audience and our viewing audience for being on today with us on our podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe to Rumination on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, and other platforms. And feel free to visit jefo.ca for more information. This podcast was brought to you by Jefo Nutrition Inc. Our goal is to work with precision nutrition, we call it, for a growing world, to improve the sustainability and lower the nutritional impacts of stressors in the animal. Thanks, and have a great day.